White phosphorus was one of the most feared weapons of World War II, with troops who encountered it often choosing to run, hide, or surrender rather than face the severe burns, choking smoke, and other gruesome effects it inflicted. While similarly brutal weapons like poison gas were held from use due to fears of retribution, Willie Pete was used openly by nearly every major power during the war, with the Allies in particular making extensive use of it due to its versatility and devastating effectiveness. Most people have no idea just how prevalent and impactful this weapon was during the Second World War, and given that it's still used in conflicts today and is often at the center of international debate, I figured it was time we take a closer look into white phosphorus. Today, we'll break down how this terrifying substance was put to use during World War II, whether using white phosphorus is a war crime, and why the movie Fury might just be the best and worst depiction of white phosphorus's use during World War II. By the way, you'll hear me refer to white phosphorus as Willie Pete at times. That's just a common military nickname for the chemical that became popular during World War II.
There's some Willie Pete in that ground floor.
It comes directly from the phonetic alphabet used during World War II, which had William as the word corresponding to W and Peter for Pete. Both of those just happened to be names that had common nicknames, so WP for white phosphorus was read William Peter, which was shortened to just Willie Pete. Now, before we dig into the devastation that white phosphorus unleashed during World War II, I'd like to quickly thank Venture Surplus for sponsoring this video and supporting my ability to keep bringing you guys military history info like this. Venture Surplus offers USGI surplus gear that's proven to work in the field. They're known for having the best grading standards in the industry and a knowledgeable and experienced team who actually tests and uses the products they sell. They're also known for their huge selection of USGI MREs and freeze-dried meals that have 5 to 30-year shelf lives. Now, love them or hate them, MREs are the best option for survival situations, backpacking, prepping, hunting, camping, LARPing, alien invasions. You want an immersive snack to eat while you play Call of Duty, and you get the point. It's a good idea for everyone to keep a few weeks of emergency meals on hand, especially with all the uncertainty in the world right now, so now's the time to take care of that. I even got you guys a discount code, so just click the link in the description to shop, then use code WWWOFF for an additional 10% off your already affordable MRE order. Alright, now let's lay the groundwork and talk about the chemical white phosphorus itself so we can better understand its use on the battlefield. White phosphorus is a highly reactive and toxic substance which is a waxy solid at room temperature. You would not want to try feeling its waxy texture with your hands though, because in addition to being poisonous, it spontaneously combusts when exposed to oxygen at slightly higher than room temperature and burns at around 2000 degrees Fahrenheit. It will continue to burn until it's fully depleted or until it's deprived of oxygen, such as by submerging it in water. As soon as it's pulled out of that water though, it can reignite and continue to burn. The chemical burns very violently, shooting out burning fragments and expelling thick white smoke in the process. It also has a low melting point, meaning it quickly turns to liquid as it burns and then sticks to anything it comes in contact with. As you can imagine from that description, when the burning phosphorus comes in contact with human skin, the results are horrific. I'll spare you the gruesome details and visuals, but just understand that once it's burned into your body, it will continue to burn until it's been completely consumed unless you're able to deprive it of oxygen. You can also absorb phosphorus through the burn, leading to poisoning, and the fumes produced by burning it can lead to respiratory issues, eye irritation, and other serious problems. It's almost cartoonishly awful. It would be hard to think up a more terrifying chemical even if you tried. Despite those effects, the primary military use for white phosphorus, at least officially, is for producing smoke, which it's very effective at. Unlike the slow-burning smoke grenades that many of us are familiar with today, white phosphorus smoke grenades use a small bursting charge to send tiny fragments of the chemical flying in all directions and igniting them in the process. This produces a thick smoke screen nearly instantly, and I'm sure you could imagine how that'd be useful for military applications. The white phosphorus rounds developed for mortars, tanks, artillery, and bazookas worked in essentially the same way, allowing troops to obscure themselves from the enemy if needed. If you want concealment right away, you could toss an M15 smoke grenade, which would immediately obscure a small area for a short period of time, or if you needed sustained concealment, you could call in a barrage of smoke rounds to cover a large area for prolonged periods. Phosphorus is still sometimes used for this purpose today, such as the red and white phosphorus smoke launchers attached to some military vehicles, which allow them to generate a smoke screen almost instantly. We covered what those burning bits of white phosphorus produced by those smoke rounds are capable of, though, so it shouldn't be surprising that those rounds also ended up being used as incendiary and anti-personnel rounds as well, and we'll talk about some more uses for Willie Pete here in a bit. Because white phosphorus could be used for so many different applications, and it was pretty damn good at all of them, the Allies used a ton of it during the war. I mean, the stuff was everywhere. Whether you were a tanker, infantryman, mortarman, artilleryman, or bombardier, you were probably using this stuff. And it's interesting to note that at least 8 Medal of Honor citations mention the use of white phosphorus grenades. Perhaps the most effective white phosphorus munition of the war, though, was fired from the 4.2-inch mortars used by the US chemical mortar companies. These large mortar rounds were highly effective, and chemical mortar companies received a very high percentage of white phosphorus rounds compared to other mortar teams. In many cases, they accounted for nearly half of all the rounds fired from these mortars. Chemical mortars were originally intended to fire all types of chemical munitions, including poison gas, but since the US never ended up deploying gas during the war, they mostly ended up being used for white phosphorus and high explosive rounds. That does bring up an interesting question though. Is white phosphorus considered a chemical weapon? Well, kind of. When we think of a chemical weapon, we often picture something like mustard gas, or at least I do. While white phosphorus is commonly grouped into the broad category of chemical weapons, that category also includes other smoke-producing chemicals and other incendiaries like thermite. Even though white phosphorus does produce toxic fumes when it burns, it typically is not considered a gas weapon. And from what I understand at least, the fumes are generally only of major concern in confined spaces. There are many accounts of troops using Willie Pete to smoke enemies out of bunkers and houses, but out in the open the fumes dissipate and oxidize fairly quickly. One period US training manual states, while the vapors of white phosphorus are exceedingly toxic, these vapors are so quickly oxidized to phosphorus pentoxide and phosphoric acid as to be harmless to men and animals in ordinary field conditions. Now, I still wouldn't want to breathe any of that in, but that's just to say that even though white phosphorus is often considered a chemical weapon, that doesn't mean it's on par with gas agents like chlorine or mustard gas. Now, we touched on some of the devastating effects that white phosphorus could have when it came in contact with enemy personnel, but oftentimes it could be extremely dangerous to the user as well. Just handling the stuff can be incredibly hazardous. Remember, it can combust just from being exposed to oxygen, so any damage to a white phosphorus grenade, bomb, or artillery round that allows air inside could set it off prematurely. The 1944 Ammunition Inspection Guide goes into detail about just how dangerous handling white phosphorus munitions can be. It even mentions that if a leak occurs in a Willie Pete round, a fire can start that will likely become uncontrollable before the fire department even arrives. This meant that carrying white phosphorus in combat conditions was even more dangerous. While a typical fragmentation grenade most often won't be set off if it's shot or damaged in battle, a white phosphorus grenade will, and there are plenty of accounts of Willie Pete grenades being hit and set off in battle. This famous photo taken by Robert F. Sargent on D-Day reportedly shows a landing craft headed towards Omaha Beach that caught fire after a German bullet struck a white phosphorus grenade carried by one of the assault troops on board. In another account, a soldier serving with the 13th Tank Battalion in Italy stated, "We formerly carried white phosphorus grenades in a box behind the turret. Recently, a mortar shell exploded one of the white phosphorus grenades, and we were unable to extinguish the resulting fire in the engine compartment. We now carry white phosphorus grenades inside the turret where they are protected but still accessible to the tank commander." In addition to the risk of these grenades being set off by enemy fire, they could still be dangerous to the user even if they worked exactly like they were supposed to. The white phosphorus hand grenades sent burning fragments in a very wide radius, and if you were planning to use one of them out in the open, you had to throw that thing pretty far to make sure those fragments didn't come back and hit you. Check out this clip of US Marines fighting in the Pacific. One Marine throws a white phosphorus grenade to flush Japanese troops out of the brush, but once he throws it, everyone starts backing away, which ended up being a smart move because, as you can see, the embers almost reach where the troops were standing. I also appreciate how after the grenade goes off, that one Marine looks back at the camera like, damn. One way to send those grenades out further was by using the M2 chemical grenade projection adapter, which allowed troops to fire the grenades from the end of a rifle by using a rifle grenade adapter. Not only did this reduce the risk of fragments flying back at the user and allow troops to engage targets at farther distances, it also made it possible to time the grenade firing such that it would detonate in the air over top of the enemy, increasing its effectiveness. One GI in the 29th Infantry Division stated, Our men like white phosphorus grenades a great deal because they get the heinies out of their holes. If you hold your rifle at about 30 degrees, you can get air bursts by using the grenade projection adapters. Our men have learned to burst these grenades over the heinies' holes, and prisoners of war say they really hate it. Now that we understand just how terrifying and dangerous white phosphorus was to be around, I feel like it's the perfect time to show you this photo of a soldier walking around with a white phosphorus hand grenade hanging from his canteen pouch by the pin. Just a little professional tip for you guys, it usually isn't a good idea to carry your grenades by the pin. I know, you're welcome. Groundbreaking stuff. Even though that method of carrying white phosphorus grenades is not recommended, troops did come up with some very effective and creative methods of using white phosphorus on the battlefield. For instance, white phosphorus was never originally intended to be used as an anti-tank weapon, but some soldiers on the front line found it to be very effective for that purpose. One group of soldiers in the US 9th Infantry Division seemed to have found that out from a captured German soldier, according to this report. A captured German non-commissioned officer stated that white phosphorus shells set his tanks on fire and were dreaded more than high explosive shells. He was taken at his word, and a concentration of white phosphorus was fired on a group of 5 enemy tanks that had been holding up an infantry unit for almost a day. High explosive shells had no effect on this group. After the white phosphorus concentration, one tank was seen burning and the other 4 withdrew. In addition to catching tanks on fire, the smoke from Willie Pete rounds was often used to temporarily blind enemy tanks, holding them in place so they could be fired on by other weapons, surrounded by anti-tank mines, or even blown up by Bangalore torpedoes and other explosives. In the best case scenarios, blowing up the enemy tank wouldn't even be necessary, like this 32nd Armored Regiment officer described. Firing phosphorus at an enemy tank often causes the crew to believe the tank is on fire and abandon it. Even if the crew didn't believe the tank was on fire, the smoke from white phosphorus rounds could sometimes fill the inside of the tank and force the crew out. Another common tactic used when firing Willie Pete from mortars and artillery is called shake and bake. Now, that nickname didn't come around until after World War II, but that same technique was used extensively during the war. Shake and bake refers to firing a mix of high explosive and white phosphorus shells to force the enemy out of cover and eliminate them. Often this refers to shaking the enemy out of a building or other cover using high explosive rounds, and then baking the exposed enemy with white phosphorus. Depending on the circumstance though, this is sometimes done in the opposite order, with white phosphorus being used to force troops out in the open and then high explosive rounds following. And oftentimes the rounds are alternated or fired in another pattern depending on what's deemed to be effective. It just depends on the specifics of the situation. One period report describes using this technique to eliminate enemy snipers that posed a risk to Allied troops. A number of enemy snipers were in an isolated stone farmhouse. 50 rounds of observed high explosive fire knocked the house apart, and 40 rounds of white phosphorus poured into the debris eliminated the snipers. At times, Willie Pete was even used as a sort of illumination round when fighting off night attacks. Unlike standard illumination rounds, which use parachute flares to provide light from above, Willie Pete burned low to the ground, which some troops used to their advantage, such as in this report from the 5th US Army in Italy. White phosphorus shell fired beyond the main body of Germans attacking at night silhouetted the enemy soldiers and enabled our machine guns to break up the attack with accurate fire. Okay, now that we've covered the basics of white phosphorus and how it was used during World War II, let's tackle one of the most common questions that comes up when discussing this weapon. Is using white phosphorus a war crime? Well, it can be, but it depends on where and how it's used. I know a lot of people believe that white phosphorus is outlawed today, or that it's allowed to be used but only for smoke, or that you can use it as an incendiary but only against equipment and not enemy personnel, and none of those things are true. Back in World War II and to this day, using white phosphorus as an incendiary munition against enemy combatants is not outlawed by any treaty or international agreement. Now, whether its use is ethical is a completely different question, but I'll try to stick to just covering the actual restrictions regarding its use. Keep in mind, I'm not a lawyer, so this is just what I was able to find in my research. Since white phosphorus is primarily considered a smoke and incendiary weapon, that means its use wasn't restricted by treaties like the 1925 Geneva Protocols concerning gas and biological weapons. For that reason, there really weren't any specific rules regarding how white phosphorus could be used during World War II, and it was basically treated just like any other weapon. So yes, white phosphorus still could be and was used in the commission of war crimes during World War II, but that would have to entail something like intentionally using it to kill civilians. Its use against enemy combatants in battle was unrestricted. In the years since World War II, additional restrictions have been put in place on incendiaries, such as the 1980 Geneva Protocol on prohibitions or restrictions on the use of incendiary weapons. This treaty outlined a few important rules regarding how incendiary weapons can be used in warfare. First, you can't use them on civilians. Second, because incendiary weapons create such indiscriminate damage, you can't use them on military targets if they're in an area of high civilian concentration, because the civilians would likely be harmed as well. And finally, you can't use them to target forests or other natural elements unless they're being used to hide enemy combatants or military targets. Those first two rules are the ones we often hear about in news headlines regarding modern conflicts, since there have been many cases of white phosphorus being used in civilian areas, which would be a war crime under those rules, right? Well, intentionally using the munitions to target civilians almost certainly would be, because that's disallowed by other rules of war outlined in different treaties. But there's actually somewhat of a loophole in that 1980 treaty that some militaries argue means it doesn't apply to white phosphorus use at all. That Geneva Protocol includes a specific exemption for munitions that are primarily used for smoke and have incidental incendiary effects. Now, some people say that that means nothing in the treaty applies to white phosphorus since it's primarily used to create smoke, while others say that this does apply to white phosphorus if it's being intentionally used as an incendiary weapon. My non-lawyer common sense interpretation is that since that treaty was meant to restrict the use of incendiary weapons, if white phosphorus is being used for that purpose, it should be covered by the rules in that treaty. With that said, the wording in the treaty does leave room for interpretation. So of course, militaries that want to use white phosphorus will exploit that loophole so they can continue using the weapon without facing repercussions. I would guess that's part of the reason why that exemption was added in the first place. Regardless of your interpretation of that treaty though, the agreement says nothing about the use of white phosphorus against enemy troops when they aren't in civilian areas. That remains completely allowed under international law. I've even heard people say things like, white phosphorus isn't allowed to be fired at enemy personnel, but it is allowed to be fired at enemy equipment. So if we fire it at enemy equipment that just happens to have enemy personnel around it, then that means it's not a war crime. That line of thinking has no basis in reality. Firing white phosphorus at enemy combatants isn't a war crime in the first place, and even if it was, claiming that you did it because there was enemy equipment nearby wouldn't change anything. This is very similar to the myth that you aren't allowed to engage enemy troops with .50 caliber rounds, but you can use it on equipment. So if you just say you were aiming at the enemy's canteen and happen to hit them, then you're in the clear. As if that's how any law works. What do you mean, officer? There's no law that says it's illegal to shoot a t-shirt. Just because somebody happened to be wearing the t-shirt when I shot it, you're trying to charge me with murder? Go ahead, try that argument in court and see how it works. Forgotten Weapons made a great video debunking that .50 cal myth a few months back, so definitely go check that out. Okay, before we wrap up, I promised I would explain why the movie Fury might just be the best and worst depiction of white phosphorus being used during World War II. So let's get into it. In the film, there are 3 scenes that prominently feature the use of white phosphorus rounds. The first time we see this munition being used is when the group encounters a German anti-tank gun set up inside a building, and Fury fires a round inside which neutralizes the gun's crew. They really nailed the appearance of the white phosphorus round detonating here. Everything about this looks pretty much just like the real footage of white phosphorus being used during World War II that I've seen. You can see the initial burst of the round with many glowing fragments flying from the building as they create thick smoke, and afterwards the fragments continue to burn and smoke on the ground while some stick to the German soldiers. I had never seen that depicted in a movie before, and I'm really glad they included it because I think it made a lot of people aware of just how brutal this weapon can be. The next time we see white phosphorus being used is during Fury's duel with the Tiger tank. Now there are many inaccuracies in this scene that I won't get into, but the look of the white phosphorus and its use to blind the Tiger tank is pretty spot on. The tank fires Willie Pete right in front of the Tiger to temporarily blind it, which as we covered earlier was a fairly common tactic. And again here, the burst of that Willie Pete round looks great. Finally, we see white phosphorus fired into a building one more time during the crew's final stand. And again, it looks exactly like I would expect it to. The problem is, none of these scenes could have actually happened during World War II. Why? Well, Fury is equipped with a 76mm main gun, and the only smoke round available for the 76 at that time was the M88 HC smoke round. This wasn't a white phosphorus round. It released a curtain of smoke similar to the regular smoke grenades that many of us are probably familiar with. Shermans that had the smaller 75mm guns could fire either the M89 smoke round, which was another slow burn smoke round like the one used in the 76, or the M64 round, which was a white phosphorus round like what we see depicted in the film. The 75mm white phosphorus rounds were so effective that even once Shermans with 76mm guns became prevalent, the smaller 75s were preferred for certain tasks, partially because they could fire Willie Pete and the 76 couldn't. I also don't understand why Fury didn't choose to fire white phosphorus in some of the other scenes in the movie. I mean, if we're putting aside the fact that it couldn't have fired it at all, but let's ignore that for a minute. In this scene, the tanks are advancing across an open field and getting lit up by anti-tank guns hidden in a tree line, while the accompanying infantry are being cut down by German machine gunners in foxholes. Not only would white phosphorus provide a smoke screen to obscure the tanks from the anti-tank guns, but troops in dense foliage and in foxholes without overhead cover are two textbook targets for the incendiary effects of Willie Pete rounds. I still really enjoy that scene overall, but it's definitely something to think about. I hope this video helped increase your appreciation for just how large of a role white phosphorus played during World War II, and just how terrifying its effects can be. In my opinion, it's right up there with poison gas and flamethrowers as one of the most brutal weapons in history. And since it's proven to be so versatile and effective in combat, I don't see it being pulled from service anytime soon. Thanks guys, if you enjoy watching these military history videos, check and make sure you're subscribed to World War Wisdom, and also consider picking up one of my white phosphorus mugs that's based on the design of a World War II white phosphorus smoke grenade. They make a great gift, and buying them really helps support my work on this channel. Other than that, thanks so much for watching. Remember not to carry your grenades by the pin, and I'll see you in the next one.